Welcome to the Bedrock Way podcast, where we're changing the habits of yesterday by creating the new healthcare reality of tomorrow. And today, Jonathan, we have a very, very special guest. I have someone who I've known for the better part of the last 2 decades, someone who I used to work with personally, someone who I've gotten to know very, very well throughout her professional journey. My guest today is someone who, we worked together, then we stopped working together. We haven't worked together probably in over a decade, but we've always stayed in touch. And I think our relationship really stemmed from the fact that we value the same things in life. Today's podcast episode is the odyssey of occupational therapy from theory to practice. Without further ado, Dr. Crowley, welcome to the Bedrock Way podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
We're going to have a lot of fun because I'm going to share with the world the gift that is Denise Crowley. And Dr. Crowley is someone who, again, is a very, very, very special person in the fact that she cares so much about her profession. She's a champion of occupational therapy. She's a champion of holistic healthcare. She's a champion of just having effective outcomes that are agnostic to the payer. And I think that's what makes her so unbelievably effective in clinical practice. And I've seen her in clinical practice, and I now see her sharing her Crowley pixie dust with the future generation. And I love watching that firsthand. Dr. Crowley earned her Bachelor's of Science in Occupational Therapy degree from Thomas Jefferson University, which is the 8th ranked occupational therapy program in the country. She has worked in geriatric occupational therapy in multiple care settings, including acute and subacute rehabilitation, skilled nursing facilities, and home care. Dr. Crowley has pursued continuing education throughout her clinical career through varied coursework, obtaining specialized certifications in osteoporosis, Parkinson's, dementia, postural remediation, and functional movement to provide evidence-based interventions for adults. Dr. Crowley has presented at both state and national conferences on a variety of geriatric occupational therapy topics, promoting restoration of function and health and wellness for the geriatric population. Dr. Crowley continued her lifelong learning, returning to Thomas Jefferson University, you went back to the old stomping grounds, to earn her doctorate in 2021. Congratulations. Her capstone and scholarship focused on occupational therapy management of osteoporosis. Dr. Crowley earned her board certification in geriatrics. A very small percentage in the country have that certification, given by the American Occupational Therapy Association in 2019. You've been busy. She has served as a fieldwork educator, new graduate mentor, and most recently, a geriatric fellowship mentor. Her passion for teaching and training has inspired her to pursue a career in academia. 10 years ago, she thought this would be not even a dream, but a nightmare. And now she brought it to reality. Dr. Crowley is excited to work with the occupational therapy faculty to develop the Monmouth University doctoral program, which we have some cutting-edge updates today on the accreditation that happened this week, the approvals and all that good stuff. Dr. Crowley, I am so happy to have you here. And we're going to have, again, a ton of insight into what's happening in clinical practice out in the field. But again, one of the biggest impetuses for me to have this conversation with you and to have you as a guest is that personally, as a clinician who's worked with occupational therapists my entire career, I've seen such a drastic change in the occupational therapy training. And we're going to get into that. But for our listeners who are not, we have a lot of listeners who are healthcare, but we have listeners who are non-healthcare. Let's discuss to the audience, what is occupational therapy?
Occupational therapy to me is a clinical practice where we work throughout the lifespan. I specialize in geriatrics, but there are many practitioners that work in pediatrics. And it's really looking at regaining meaningful activity for our clients. We want to take what is dysfunctional and make it functional within their capacity. So we do that all around the idea of meaningful occupation, making sure that their treatments, their programming is salient. We know through research that the more salient the occupation and treatment the more compliant the patient will be and the further they'll be able to progress. So occupational therapy means many things to many people. It really does depend on what healthcare setting that you're working in and what focus of education and training that you kind of go through.
And you mentioned something that's very clear, and the fact is that occupational therapy intervention has to make sense to the patient. If there is a invested functional carryover that they can champion themselves, it becomes very easy for them to become your care partner rather than your care adversary, which sometimes we see. But I will tell you, and I'll go a little more granular into what I've seen in the occupational therapy progress the last 20 years. I used this word a couple of podcasts ago. I used the word metamorphosis, right, which is an evolution, a rapid evolution that sometimes happens unexpectedly, but sometimes happens because it needs to happen. And I think the role of an occupational therapist has metamorphosized tremendously the last 2 decades. And I'll give you some insight from my perspective. I used to work with occupational therapists, Denise, who did not know how to take vital signs. Occupational therapists who were not allowed to ambulate their patients. They couldn't walk with their patients. Occupational therapists who thought that everybody did not have lower extremities and feet and knees and hips because they were only relegated to treat the upper extremity. Shoulders. They saw everybody as a shoulder. They saw everybody as a hand. They saw everybody as an elbow. They saw everybody as an eye, right? Vision and neurological things that occupational therapists do so well. Stuff that we call sequencing and executive functions. But that has changed, right? We actually in occupational therapy are teaching the future clinicians that you can treat the whole person. So talk to me about that, because the role of OT, that is what I am so enamored with right now. And we employ occupational therapists here who embody that. What clicked? What changed? What was the crossroad that the occupational therapy profession went through to demand this change?
I think our focus on looking at research, I think our focus on evidence-based practice, I think we have gained skills that now allow us to look beyond, just the upper half of the body. I lived that. I've been a clinician for 30 years. And the beginning of my practice was just that. I was really delegated to the upper body. You would never see me do a lower body extremity exercise because that was PT. It was, and still I haven't worked in skilled nursing for some time, but when I worked in skilled nursing, I was not allowed to comment on someone's mobility. I was not allowed to comment on bed mobility because that was relegated to physical therapy. I think we're starting to see patients more holistically, and we've developed a skill set through, I'm hoping, my role in academia to develop clinicians that look at them holistically and treat them holistically, giving them the skills to walk out into practice, to have a decent understanding of how to treat someone, how to treat them, doing lower body exercises, doing posture remediation, doing movement training as they're incorporating it into their daily occupation. So I think our skills have improved. I think our academics have improved in that way to allow our clinicians to go out into the field. I try and teach and train my students to have a good understanding, and when they don't have that area of expertise, to know where to go to collaborate.
Listen, that is a very diplomatic answer. But I will tell you, to me, it never made sense. And I'm dominated by common sense. I'm going to tell you something. So occupational therapists worked on what we call the 6 main ADLs, the 6 main activities of daily living, right? And then we can juxtapose that into instrumental activities of daily living as well, right? Which are 7 of them. So I'm going to throw this question back at you, but let me just make a comment. The 6 standard ADLs are generally recognized as bathing, dressing, toileting, transferring, getting in and out of bed or a chair, eating, and continence. ADLs are the most common triggers used by insurance companies to determine eligibility for long-term care insurance benefits. And with the silver tsunami among us, and people being, and we have about 10,000 new Medicare enrollees daily. And with the migrant crisis, that is supposed to probably go on for a very long time. It was scheduled to be 2028. Now it's potentially saying 2035. So I'm sorry, but to me, as far as I know, people have needed to bathe, dress, toilet, transfer, eat, and be continent for a very long time. So that's why it's been puzzling to me. I don't think it's research. We don't need to research that somebody needs to go to the bathroom. We don't need to research that somebody needs to get dressed.
We need to know how to do it effectively.
So let's talk about that. So it's not the research per se, but it's the training.
It's the training. It's the training
So
and our skill set.
So how are we better training? Because the needs have always been the same. And if we look at the IADLs, using the telephone, shopping, preparing meals, housekeeping, using transportation, taking medications, and managing finances. Again, things that we've been doing for a very long time. And the main profession that's been targeted to focus on those things hasn't been properly prepared. And I'll give you another one, right? I'll give you another one. So you guys focus on ADLs. You guys focus on IADLs, things that give people quality of life. Quality of life. But yet, the common theme around when I tell someone that someone is an occupational therapist, what they say is, oh, what do? Do they get people jobs?
It's a common misconception.
So I want to know from someone who's been in the field for 30 years, someone who's extremely trained, what has changed in the training and the application of the research. I think that's what it is. It's not the research, but the application of the research and how it translates over to movement disorders to be able to make people independent. Because I'll tell you right now, if this is what the insurance companies are using to determine eligibility, then there's a tremendous, tremendous interest to make sure that these things are covered.
I can speak to how I teach and train my students and my curriculum that we've developed at Monmouth University. I do try and teach and train and take the evidence and connect the dots for my students. I teach a clinical medicine class that goes over pathologies, disease processes, and I need them to understand what that is when they walk into clinical practice, what that patient looks like. How does that disorder, dysfunction, illness, injury impair their ability to perform occupation and their occupational performance? We then have to go into kinesiology and movement. So I essentially train the first year foundation classes of the Monmouth University students, which is wonderful because I can connect those dots from clinical medicine to movement disorder, then on to adult rehab, and going into intervention. So it's a really nice trajectory of education that I hope that we're providing to our students now, kind of filtering through and threading through the use of movement analysis, the use of an occupational profile. I teach a cognition class that goes very heavily into how to teach and train our clients in the best, most effective way. So that is my hope, that my students go out into the field and use all of those basic understanding of science, evidence, and knowledge and apply it to treatment planning and intervention planning. So I think that is how I try to get my students out in the field and really looking at our patients holistically. From a cognitive psychosocial, I don't teach the psychosocial courses, but we have a heavy psychosocial curriculum so that they understand what those psychosocial components are to disease, disability, injury, and illness.
We're talking about medical disease, right? Medical differential diagnosis done by an occupational therapist. This would have been a foreign language 10 years ago. Maybe a foreign language, definitely 20 years ago. That is the difference between what I call confident medicine and defensive medicine. And defensive medicine has been perpetuated by a term that I absolutely do not like, and I've never been a fan of. And I want to talk to you about this term. And the term is called the scope of practice. The scope of practice. In academia, we are investing. We just talked about the metamorphosis of the occupational therapy training, research, the application of a skill set that is now more adept to aligning itself with the needs of our patients, the needs of our seniors. But yet, the scope of practice hasn't changed.
It's not.
The scope of practice hasn't changed. But yet, you are telling me that occupational therapists are being trained to be able to look at the origin of the movement dysfunction, which has a medical undertone, right? That sometimes stems outside of the scope of practice, and give you the ability to understand when to refer another clinician who's more specialized in that field. But I believe, Denise, that the scope of practice, especially for occupational therapists, has been something that has held them back.
It's limited.
Because you teach and you build the academic framework of their education around the scope of practice. You guys have broken the guardrails of the scope of practice of an occupational therapist. The scope of practice of our seniors is changing, hence the academic preparation of our clinicians must change. Mm-hmm. So how has the scope of practice of occupational therapists changed in your professional career? And hence, how are you preparing the future generation of clinicians to be ready for that augmenting aspect of the scope of practice? Because the scope of practice is a legal term. It's not a clinical term.
I think a big part of it is our demonstration of our skill set, our demonstration of our knowledge, our demonstration of pushing that scope of practice into emerging practice areas and revisiting that as much as possible. So a large part of our curriculum as well is leadership and advocacy, to really kind of push those boundaries. Now that we have information and we're developing really good, solid scientific skill sets, how do we move into different practice areas? How do we kind of challenge that scope of practice and move into areas that we have not gone before? I think a lot of focus on our curriculum is health and wellness. We do a lot of community practice. We do a lot of different programming to kind of expand our reach within our community or our population. So that's kind of, we're trying to pioneer the new generation of occupational therapists to give them the opportunities that maybe I didn't have and I didn't even think to have back in the day, So I think that's what we can give to push it a little bit, to give them the knowledge and understanding of what direction we want healthcare to go. We don't want healthcare to stay the way it is because it's not effective all the time. So we like to give them different opportunities out in the field to expand programming within our community. We do a lot of leadership training because we are a doctoral program for them to become and go out into the field with an agenda and a purpose, right? So that's kind of the direction that we hope to see occupational therapy go.
But you guys have adopted something that I feel should have been adopted long ago, and that's the team sport mentality around healthcare and medicine. And you guys do it in your innovation labs. You guys do it by having multiple specialties interact and have the ability for them to apply their knowledge base for the betterment of the outcome of the patient. I want you to elaborate on how that team sport mentality has changed, at least the preparation of future clinicians. But I want to give you another caveat to that. It's great and dandy for us to do it in the academic setting, but what are we doing for the established clinicians out there who haven't picked up a textbook, who haven't picked up the research, who haven't looked at any journal, who are not AOTA members, who are just going through the motions and being those, they're practicing of a patient today the way they were trained 30 years ago. What are we doing as a profession to make sure that if an occupational therapist that was graduated in 1995 is using 2023 research, like you said, evidence-based research, to treat me and get that better outcome, right? Because then if you're not, then you're more liability to the insurance company. So let's take the first question first. The team sport mentality. Let's talk about how Monmouth University in your academic setting, has honed that And then let's caveat that into clinical practice for the experienced occupational therapists. What is the obligation that we have right now to ensure that we bring them up to speed with the future generation?
So at Monmouth, we're constantly trying to develop some opportunities to work with the other disciplines that are on campus with us. We recently did one with the PA students, our physician assistant students, where we went into a facility and they did history and physicals on patients. The occupational therapy students came in and did cognitive testing using the MOCA testing. They all became certified. It was an in-field experience with actual patients. That was the highlight of their semester. We then met up with the physician assistants and collaborated, and they gave the history and medical information to my OT students. That's their lane, that's their expertise. They gave diagnostic testing and things like that they would recommend, any medications, whereas our occupational therapy students came and gave the results of their testing. They had a really wonderful conversation of how to treat and train this person with 4 positive outcomes. Again, we're constantly trying to develop IPE events with nursing, just to kind of understand what everyone's role is and where to go and how to have that conversation and speak to them, because it takes a team to get our patients and clients better. It takes a team, and everyone has an area of expertise that we need to respect, appreciate, and know to look to. So we're constantly looking for opportunities to do that with other disciplines, so that, my students know where to go and how to and what information they need to provide for the best outcomes for the patient.
And as you're saying, I'm thinking in my mind, an analogy to that, a visual analogy. And I think what you're referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we have seen the occupational therapy blinders come off. A horse, right? A horse that runs a race, the thoroughbred, they put on the blinders because the blinders allow that horse not to have any distractions, and they can just focus on the finish line. And I think that's how clinical practice has been, right? We get a diagnosis or we get a patient, and then there are blinders, and we're just going to do that. Your academic platform has taken the blinders off, where people are now looking left, right, up, and down, and are communicating. And teamwork leads to learning. Individuals have their own set of skills and strengths. When the whole team works as a unit, everyone has an opportunity to learn from each other. Teamwork is effective. It gets people better. It makes people feel better. This process leads to resource building and enables the team to become the better equipped to deal with new challenges. But you mentioned something, communication. Mm-hmm. For teams to work well together, they need to communicate well and be on the same page. The ability to openly share information, align expectations, and offer feedback is essential in the workplace. And no workplace is that more essential than in taking care of patients, taking care of lives. Yes. However, communication isn't only about sharing messages. Listening plays an equally important role. Are you seeing the clinicians, the young clinicians, listening to one another? Because I'll go back to the scope of practice, right? A PA scope of practice is very different and sometimes wider than an occupational therapy, wider than a speech therapist. How do we maintain that communication so there's an open mind, right? A latitude of flexibility in the discretion that your word and your clinical recommendation is just as important as mine.
It's very interesting that you say that. I just recently took on a class for group dynamics, and that is what we're talking about right now: active listening, motivational interviewing, providing feedback. So one of the challenges for my students is to give and receive constructive, positive, and constructive feedback, which is difficult for people to do. But it's a skill that is required in any healthcare setting. So that is part of our curriculum. That is part of their training. Throughout my curriculum, I do competency-based training for many of my skills, and they are required to give each other peer feedback. And they'll laugh if they see this. I say, I don't want sunshine and unicorns. I want really constructive feedback because that's how we learn. I tell stories all the time of my career. I've learned so much from other disciplines, from physical therapists, from respiratory therapists, from nurses. Ask questions. Ask questions. Have that conversation because that's how we learn. And I think they're starting to get more comfortable with that as students entering the field, and that's my hope, is that we all start to look at each other and understand what our area of expertise is and know where to go and have that conversation and feel comfortable having that conversation. So it's a skill that we do embed in our curriculum. And I know I'm talking about Monmouth a lot. It's just what I know, right? So this is my home right now, and this is what I know. And I'm new to academia. So I'm happy to say that we're really trying to develop a clinician to be holistic in their treatment, have the skill set to walk into the clinical field, have confidence in their skills, be able to have that conversation and sit on that team and be a presence on that team and not sit behind PAs, nursing, PTs, but join and be right among them.
And hence, confident medicine. It doesn't matter what role you have in the clinical continuum. It doesn't matter what role you have in the ecosystem. What matters is that you're confident within your skin to speak up. You're confident within your skin to challenge the status quo. I agree with you in healthcare, especially in dealing with a high acuity rate in our patients, a complex patient. Comorbidities are continuing to rise, chronic care issues. We have to be able to disagree. We have to be able to challenge one another. I've always said everyone has their scope of practice, but I think everyone needs to have an invested interest that the objective and the best outcome of that patient should prioritize.
Is the patient.
Right? Mm-hmm. Should prioritize clinical practice. So what do we do for our, again, experienced occupational therapists who are out in the field, who've been out for 20, 30 years, who may not be listening to this podcast? How do we help them be successful and, most importantly, take care of our patients in the dynamic that we're discussing today, which, as revolutionary as it may seem, is more of rudimentary?
I think healthcare is changing in a way that's going to force some of them to do just that or force them to leave the field, to be honest. We're really going to outcomes and value-based systems, and I think that's where healthcare should go. There's a lot of waste in the industry at times, and it's going to challenge clinicians who have been practicing the same way for many, many years to step up or step out, to be honest with you, because I think it's uncomfortable to be the clinician at this point in practice, not to have the skill set, or there'll be a time where they will be called out for their lack of skills.
I love
That's what they foresee healthcare going to be. I try, whether it be students, whether it be colleagues, to embed that this is a lifelong learning career. We don't finish school and stop learning. I go to continuing ed. I have certifications yearly that I keep up with because I'm invested in my career. I'm invested in the care of my patients. I'm still treating. I'm still a clinician. And it's important to me to know that I'm giving best practice. How do I challenge? I think it's going to play out in a way that might make them uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
I love that. And I love that. Not that I want to see people out of a profession, but I've always said the last person in medical school is called a doctor. And the last person in occupational therapy school is called an occupational therapist. So I do think that as people who value clinical outcomes and then people who are looking to elevate the aptitude level of our profession, we need to be challenging people. And we'll talk about job growth and technology. The job growth in occupational therapy is staggering in the next couple of years. And I'll give you guys some statistics, and it just makes sense, right? People are needing our services more and more. People are living longer, more. Alzheimer's and dementia and diagnoses that not only from a neuromuscular perspective preclude the ability of independence in those IADLs, ADLs, but also there's a tremendous amount of modern medicine that's keeping people alive longer, right? So the need for occupational therapy is not going away. This is why these conversations need to be had more and more, and I agree with you. I think people need to be made to feel a little bit more uncomfortable, because when you're uncomfortable, you have a decision to make. Either I grow or I step out. And I think knowing the fortitude of our colleagues, I think
Probably not very popular idea.
yeah, but you know what? It's one that has to be talked about. One that has to be talked about, because I've always said, we have to be agents of change. And if we're not agents of change, unfortunately, we become, casualties of that evolution. So listen to this from a business perspective, right? We'll talk about clinical value. I think we've made a case that the clinical value of occupational therapy, the profession, the theory to practice, and the evolving application of the research. I don't think it's a discovery of the research, the application of the research, and hence the equipment of skill sets of the future generation has just skyrocketed. And I give you a ton of credit for being, again, a change agent of doing that. But when we talk about a business, right, this is healthcare. And this is the power of working together. Teams that work together in healthcare are more productive and motivated towards company goals. That makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. But let me give you the business outcome of that. Highly engaged teams showed a 21% increase in profitability. Think about that. 21% increase in profitability. Teamwork helps everyone to communicate better and more often in real time, thus minimizing friction and delays, which all cost money. All this in turn leads to higher quality output and a 25% better measure of clinical outcomes. So what we're saying is that if we are able to start maybe looking at the scope of practice limitation a little easier, and we start saying to everybody, maybe forget a scope of practice, right? We were all trained to apply our clinical skills differently. But everybody has the same scope of practice, which is taking care of that patient. Depending on what scope you're looking at, everyone has the same scope of practice, which is to get that patient better, to identify the disease process, to identify the movement disorder, and to apply a care plan that gets you to achieve the goals quicker. So I think if everyone has the same scope of practice, I think that's a better way to get people to work together more often. Because the scope of practice, Denise, you have to admit, is putting a guardrail between clinicians. So let's change gears a little bit into the technology innovation. Because again, we can't grow in 2023 in clinical practice without talking about AI technology and how technology will not replace, but enhance clinical practice in the occupational therapy setting. Tell me what Monmouth University is doing from an innovation technology standpoint to apply. You mentioned the MOCA test, and I know that can sprout technology needs in some of the patients. So tell me how we're doing to, again, provide that continuous care management and again, assist patients who may need help long term.
I think technology, the role in healthcare, really needs to be the basis of our communication and development of an interdisciplinary care team. We teach and train them using different technologies. We get them right on an electronic health record because that's the documentation that's required. We use our simulation lab to teach and train them and apply clinical skills. So we're using that kind of education-based technology. But I think once they get out into the field, this generation is so tech savvy and so resourceful that they're way ahead of that scope that I am. But I think we have to look at the use of technology to our benefit for our patients, and how do we embed that in their treatment planning? I teach the adult rehab and the older adult rehab class, and we talk about the use of technology and when it's effective and when it's not effective. Older adults, my old adults, we joke. I said, you can't give them an exercise program on an iPhone. How do you adapt to their level? They are so tech savvy, and they'll come to me with projects all the time on iPhones and computers and iPads, and it's wonderful and it's amazing. And I'm like, that's fantastic. For 5 years into your practice, it's going to work beautifully. For the day you walk out into practice, we need to rethink this. We need to think of the use of technology to communicate within our team, within healthcare systems. There's no reason that we shouldn't have access, to records, lab values, and all of that. As an occupational therapist practicing in certain settings, again, more medically oriented, which occupational therapy isn't always medically oriented, but if you're in a practice setting that requires those skills, it's important for us to understand what the lab values are, what the diagnostic testing is, and to have access to that information just makes me a stronger and better clinician. So having my occupational therapist, the new generation, understanding that, understanding in different care settings where technology and community practice can work and how that can outreach into community resources. So I think that's where technology can really benefit our practice, as well as healthcare, health and wellness programming, and all of those areas of practice.
So again, we know technology is going to work. We know technology is going to influence occupational therapy intervention. What specifically? Give me some. Are there some gadgets? Are there some programs, hardware, software? What are we using? What are we looking into? And I'll give you an example of what we're doing here. Right? So one thing that we're looking big time. So we always say that we are the new medical specialty. Right? We are the new medical specialty that no one is talking about but should be talking about. The new medical specialty here is that we are chronic care managers. We are not primary care providers. We are chronic care managers. Our patients have chronic care conditions. All of our patients have chronic care conditions primarily. If you're seeing a senior, and sometimes middle age, have chronic care conditions, they need continuous care management. So we say we are chronic care managers. And in being able to see someone from a chronic care perspective, Denise, I need to be able to plug literally and figuratively technology in that patient, whether it's by a biometric device like a pulse oximeter that's on the network, a blood pressure cuff, a scale, a wearable. I have to use technology to help me retain and get immediate vital sign and values on that patient, so I can proactively monitor and anticipate, sometimes eliminate, sometimes avoid exacerbations or acuities. So tell me specifically from a technology standpoint, and again, I'll augment that into our EMRs. Our EMRs need to start getting smart. And by that I mean things like natural language processing, things like machine learning. They need to start adding the predictive analytics to allow people to make better clinical decisions. So tell me and if it's nothing, that's fine. But I want to know you guys are very, very, very progressive. So they can help us with technology. And again, I want to know from an academia standpoint, especially theory, what are we doing from an innovation perspective, technology-wise, to get the future generation to be more confident out there and make better clinical decisions?
So if you look at applying it to clinical practice, they are looking at different types of technology. One area of occupational therapy for that type of system would be for us to assess their use of it and how to have them engage with that technology for their proper use. So what would an occupational therapist do? They would test their cognition, their vision, things like that, to be sure that they're able to participate in the use of technology. That would be one role of an occupational therapist, and that is one thing that we teach and train our students. Another thing is kind of showing them the differences between high-tech and low-tech things that can be done. within the home. We're talking within the home. We do a lot of aging in place education. So looking at simple things like wearables, simple things like wandering alarms, bed alarms, all the way up to smart homes. So those are things that occupational therapy students learn, and occupational therapists in the field will start to develop a better comfort with. As the generation moves through, our baby boomers are more tech savvy than our older adults. So I think that's an area, and I've told my students that they will be open and receptive to, because aging in place is kind of the direction that most of them want to be. I don't remember statistics the way you do, but I mean, the majority of older adults will age in place and age in their home. So to make that a safe environment that keeps them safe and independent is really the goal of occupational therapy. So it really depends on whether it be low-tech devices such as alarms, different gadgets for independent opening of doors. Now there's smart kitchens, there's smart homes, everything can be directed from your phone, to even what the years ago would have been high tech would be the Ring system that people have. We talk about that all the time, and how you can embed these basic safety elements within someone's home just to keep them safe, keep them in their home, and keep them more independent.
That's what I wanted to hear from you. So I went to a training a couple of days ago where we talked about the dangers of AI. And when anytime people think about AI, Denise, they think about Terminator, right? They think about Terminator. They're going to take over our lives, and the world's going to end. And actually, we're very, very far from that, and probably won't be there anytime soon, if ever. But what the speaker said at the event, what scares him the most is toddler AI. That's how he described it. Toddler AI, meaning that our technology is so basic. It's so basic, and you're right. In healthcare, there's so many things that we can do that are basic, that are going to be able to behaviorally modify the function of our patients and make them safer. Geofence their behavior, so we're able to learn their routines and, again, anticipate and put systems in place that keeps them safe. And like you said, age in place, because 95% of seniors want to be home. They don't want to be in long-term care. They don't want to be spend the rest of their lives, going back and forth, dealing with the arduous process of what we call recidivism, right, back and forth. And so toddler AI, I agree with you. And when the speaker said that, it resonated with me, because I'm like, wow, healthcare has always been late to the party when it comes to innovation. Healthcare has always been late to the party when it comes to technology and adopting technology. We like to do things the hard way. We don't do things the smart way. There is a mortgage company that uses AI to sift through mortgage applications. They've been using the AI since 1996. But here we are in 2023, almost 30 years later, talking about AI scouring through clinical documentation to be able to give us the ability to make better clinical decisions. So we are way behind. So I think it's an opportunity for us that needs to really lead from the front. So let's talk about the job prospects of occupational therapy, which I did a little research, and it's actually better than I thought. One thing, good news is you're going to have a job forever if you want to. The job outlook for occupational therapists has never been better. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, employment of occupational therapists is projected to grow 17% between 2020 and 2030. It's incredible. 1/5 of the workforce of occupational therapy is going to grow. And in 2021, the median annual wage for an occupational therapist was almost $90,000. Not a bad living, right? Employment of occupational therapists continues to grow, and right now there are approximately 9,600 openings for occupational therapists that are being projected to grow year over year over the next decade. That's incredible. That's incredible. And if the job outlook isn't good enough, if the job outlook doesn't tell you everything you need to know, right? Because people are prognosticating the census needs. There's also a change in the future coming for occupational therapy. I'm not sure if you know this, Denise, but it's the OT Compact by 2024, right? Which the compact will be an interstate professional licensing compact for occupational therapists to address working across state lines. This compact will improve patient access to therapy as well as enhance the mobility of occupational therapy practitioners. Kind of the theme of today is liberating us from the guardrails that have really restraint, held back the occupational therapy career, profession. And being in the front seat and seeing that liberation happen, that's a pretty cool feeling. The cage door has been opened. Maybe the occupational therapist has been a caged animal, right? And we've opened that door of the caged animal. And there's two things that a caged animal does. They either bust out and go get what they need, or they stay where they are because they become relegated to living in a cage. And I think it's the former. Mm-hmm. I think the occupational therapists are waiting to bust out of that cage and take their place within the healthcare continuum as a prominent, productive participant of patient care.
I agree.
So tell me, again, in your perspective, how you see the future cage animal evolving as they continue to grow professionally, academically, and most importantly, start growing within the healthcare continuum. How do you see the future of occupational therapy?
I think this conversation has focused a lot around very traditional medical healthcare systems, right? And that's where I was born and raised in occupational therapy. So that's my familiar clinical treatment area. For occupational therapy, I think that will continue to develop with our skills that we are developing through academia and in clinical practice. I think we will sit at the table and we will be a presence at that table. So that is my hope for occupational therapists in a more medically oriented traditional healthcare. What is amazing to me, and I think that forced animal that you're talking about, is the emerging practice areas that occupational therapy has gone into. In more social situations, we're working with more marginalized communities. We're going out into communities and doing much more work in non-traditional settings, which that I think is where we can benefit as a profession from kind of standing on our own, if so to speak, which is amazing to see. I see through my students' capstone projects how they're really moving from more medically oriented healthcare systems to out in the community and doing program development and community-based programming from an occupational therapy standpoint, which is where I think the direction for some occupational therapists will be.
Love it.
That's really exciting to me to see how we're expanding our role, not only in the healthcare system, but within systems.
I want to focus this part of the podcast on the accreditation process that you have helped spearhead at Monmouth. And tell us a little bit about that. I know you recently had a big win for the team, which I felt like I had a little bit of involvement in that, which I didn't, but I felt, I felt like I was part of the team and I was like, rah, 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 rah. But I just want you to give us a little bit of background on that, because that's exciting.
It was very exciting.
Right? It's exciting. It's one thing.
It's a big accomplishment.
Exactly. One thing is to conceptually say, I'm going to change the game. And the other thing is actually doing it. You guys are actually changing the game, and patient care is going to be better off long term because of you guys. And I've always said the legacy of a clinician is not to enter healthcare amazingly, but to leave it better than they entered it. And you guys are doing that. So walk us through the accreditation process. And then I want to hear from you a couple of milestones that you'll always remember from this process.
So it definitely takes a team. Our department chair was really such a leader in getting the systems and organizations in place. It's a very long process to really match every single. There's 130 standards that need to be met.
Wow.
Right. So from ACODE. So it's a very detailed oriented procedure that we had to go through each standard and make sure that our assignments, our curriculum, all met the standard, and provide artifacts to ACODE for that. It was an amazing process because I learned so much from the other faculty that I work with. We have a unique faculty in that we all have different areas of expertise. We have some that are much more socially oriented and have leadership and entrepreneurship and all of those areas of expertise. So it was really interesting to see the artifacts and assignments and things like that they were creating to meet the standards that are really pushing academia forward to produce very sound clinicians. So it was a team effort. And it was amazing to see how really detailed our curriculum had to be in order to meet those standards. And it was really amazing in that they walked out and we were compliant with 130 standards. So knock on wood, in December, they will give us our full accreditation for the program. So it was exciting. It was a lot of work. And again, like I said, the team, I have an amazing team that I work with. They're very helpful. I call myself the rookie on the team because I'm the newest one to academia. And, I was the one that had the most questions because I haven't done this. And they were really very supportive in educating me on how this process goes, and how detailed things needed to be to match that standard.
And I'm so delighted that I get the opportunity to say this to you. But I am so proud of you. I'm so proud of the woman, the leader, the mentor that you have become. I'm so proud of an individual who continues to challenge themselves. I'm so proud of the fact that you're sharing the gift that you were given, with the future generation. And the fact that you do it with class. The fact that you do it with the most genuine humility. You never need to take all the credit. But everybody knows. Everybody knows that you're special. Everybody knows that you're different. And everybody knows that when they tell you or where they give you something to do, you're going to do it better than everybody else. And I really appreciate you. I respect you a ton. I love our relationship. I love our friendship. I love the professional ability that we have to really exercise, no pun intended, the ability to grow the minds of tomorrow. And I'm so happy to be a change agent with you. And I look forward to continuing to do that in the years to come. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And we are changing the habits of yesterday by creating the new healthcare reality of tomorrow. Thank you, Denise. Appreciate you.
Thank you.